I'd like to thank the City of Taipei and our hosts here. It's so nice to be back in the Shui Shui Institute again. It's I actually see familiar faces from a year ago. And one thing that I'm really looking forward to about today is to go back over some of the territory we've been exploring already over the past year. Different ways of looking at the lessons from other cases and examples from around the world, and to bring this to bear now on a more developed discussion here in Nangang. One of the things that we have been doing at INTA is to clarify an approach to the innovation economy, the planning of the innovation economy, and we're starting to call it workspace urbanism. And one of the things that we have been wanting to do with workspace urbanism is to link the ideas of what's happening in the innovation economy to the approaches to planning and spatial development that you're facing in cases like Nangang. But I want to start by just applauding the efforts of the Urban Regeneration Office here in Taipei, and also the work of Cosmos. And I want to highlight 6 key preliminary ideas that seem to have been developed by these teams here, and to say some of the ways in which I think these key ideas will also be reflected in some of what we can learn from international projects. So the first of these, there we go. One of the things that we have heard mentioned is that we will harness the potential of the creative and technology industries. We've heard a lot about that, but we will take advantage of its positioning, both locally in relation to Xinyi and Meihu, but also in a more regional, global context. The positioning of Nangang through its transportation infrastructure. We also want to conceptually expand the district, to think about the role of the riverside, the role of the hills nearby, in really capturing the full potential of Nangang as a district. We want to understand how this hillside can provide a recreation area that will link Academica Sinica, the Xinyi district, and the new developments in Nangang, and to bring them to bring this potential down into a kind of coexistence with the Keelong River, and find new ways of taking advantage of that resource. Another point is to differentiate the different urban quarters within the overall district, such that we would see the area near the Nangang software park as, in a way, conceptually different in its character than the area around the forthcoming Taipei Pop Music Center. So what we want to do is to understand this as a living and developing approach to urban areas that really depend, as I think Michelle was pointing towards, the interactions that are based both in the lives of present residents and future stakeholders of the area. And we want also to develop an inclusive approach to housing. So later today we'll hear more about approaches to affordable housing and the key role that this plays in the redevelopment of Nangang. Finally, we want to talk about the new kinds of delivery mechanisms. What can we learn from other projects around the world about the way in which the ambitions for Nangang can be delivered, can be implemented through a planning process, but through financing instruments and new ways of creating contracting authorities that have the power to deliver an integrated project that really fulfills the ambitions of the city. Now, one of the things that I think we're all recognizing is that the challenge we face is that of building effective, competitive, sustainable cities. And we need to do that by thinking really about the foundations of the project in patterns, changing patterns of work, to make good on the possibilities here in Nangang, to turn these empty lands into really productive territory for future residents, current residents. This will involve understanding the role that new job-generating patterns in the innovation economy can deliver to these kinds of environments. And I think that you've taken many important steps in the rethinking of what a software park would look like. So Nangang is, of course, very different than the traditional software park that we've seen a few decades ago. But what I want to stress is that it's not just about a specialization in software department, but it's about deepening the reach of the technologies and the know-how that is embedded in these businesses. It's about moving from specialization to localization. You've taken tremendous steps in rethinking the nature of an exhibition center. It is now really a component of an urban environment rather than just being a standalone box to which people come. We can see that important steps have been made here in Taipei that really transform the urban character of some of these urban elements. Here's an example I find very inspiring. Your corporate headquarters of the GTAC Corporation. And one of the things that's very nice about this is not only the generous landscaping, the terrific lobby, the hosting resources up above, but it's also about really converting the potential of these kinds of office environments into something that really serves the local community. Now, this is an image from Hsinchu Science Park, and of course it's very, very difficult to serve a local community in the formal organization of the science park. But if you looked at the GTAC offices, what's exciting about it is that there's a nice auditorium that could be used by local schools, by the local community for performances, and there's a kind of crossover that I'll want to discuss later on as we look at some projects from London. So I think one of the things that we want to recognize is that for the purposes of something like Nangang, the idea of the science park or the technology park is not nearly intensive enough. It is not nearly as well integrated into the city, no matter how fantastic the service delivery model is. The technology park does not really harness the real potential that comes with the investment in companies as a tool for urban development and the transformation of the lives of the residents and the future stakeholders. So one of the things we want to learn from other projects around the world is the way in which the kind of service orientation that we see in high technology businesses today can really become part of an urban environment. Now here is a building we'll return to later. This is King's Place in London. But what is happening in King's Place is that there's a conference center, an auditorium in the basement that can be used as a music performance venue in the evenings and can be used as an office conference center during the daytime. What that means is that the business community begins to subsidize the creative community, and we might say vice versa. The creative community supports the real needs of a changing business community. It's a synergy and collaboration that becomes part of the urban fabric. This you cannot do in a technology park. This you can do in a workspace neighborhood. Now, so one of the things that we want to do is to talk about the ways in which we're learning from how cities actually work, how mobility systems work, how axes are converted into areas. Axes are converted into areas of interaction, of learning, of growth, of change in the urban economy. This is an overview of Bilbao, famous for having supposedly converted from an industrial environment to a cultural economy. What I'd like you to notice is that there are, I think I'm I'm not going to be quite so. If we could go back one slide. There are axes that you will notice very vividly in the image of Bilbao. Bilbao is really a very 19th century axial city in many ways. But it also involves an older part of the city that is transformed as we moved into the 19th century. There was a wonderful Beaux-Arts expansion. As we move into the 20th century, it became industrial. As we move in now into the 21st century, it's becoming a city of creativity and technology where there's an overlap between the creative industries and remaining heavy industries such as steel, auto parts, nanotechnology, and so on. So there's a very rich mix. And the way in which we want to understand a city like this is one in which it's not only about an overview that emphasizes axes, but it's about the creation of meaningful urban areas. And I think this is something that is important to remember. Here also in London, we see an important series of axes that each have a different character. As we come in more closely, we can see that one of these, the Euston Corridor, contains a number of very important institutions and economic drivers, from the University College Hospital to 3 of our mainline train stations, the Wellcome Trust, several office buildings. But as you can see that it's also, go ahead one more, you can see that it's also in some ways a barrier in the environment. Now, one of the things that we've needed to do then with London is to understand the way in which this begins as we zoom in to turn into differentiated urban areas. And these areas are structured by patterns of work. It's a very important area for engineering, for biotechnology, for new media, but it's also an area that is structured very much by patterns and technologies of movement. And we can see in all of these images that there's a very rich pattern of moving through the streets that is part of a networking economy. So much so that people, in a way, live in the streets and very much engage in an economy supported by a very rich mobility system. So these kinds of innovative milieu are structured by patterns of engagement, interaction, learning, movement. They're very robust and dynamic in their characteristics. And this is something we can learn from older cities. But I think the big questions we have are, what can we learn from projects that we see around the world today? The Rive Gauche project in Paris is part of a much larger rethinking. Is there perhaps is there one of these where yes, there we go. So the Rive Gauche is here. It's part of the wider eastern arc of Paris. Many of you will know the Parc de la Villette up here. Many of you will know also the Parc Bercy and the related developments here, and a series of smaller infill projects to help stabilize the working class communities of eastern Paris. But what's exciting about this is that it has been able to begin to raft over the rail lines, much as you've decided to do in Nangang, and to create a rich mixture of residential communities as well as go ahead and go forward. This one, it seems to be jumping all over the place. Anyway, residential communities and new approaches to housing. At the same time that it also has a new series of educational institutions and government offices, a very advanced rail station that also makes use of the underground facilities as a potential for display and exhibition. There are fashion shows that are held in this space. And another project is I see. It doesn't seem to have any control over this. Is there? Maybe I'll just ask you to move it for me. Okay. So if we go back one, go back one. Now, what is I think distinctive about the Rive Gauche project is that while it has nevertheless achieved a great amount in terms of building the Eastern Arc seamlessly through Paris, it is primarily what I would think of as a zoning exercise. If one looks carefully, it is really an exercise in creating a space for government ministries and for educational institutions, quite separate in a way from the housing. And it's done a very good job of achieving urban development, but there's not a tremendous amount of synergy. If we now go to the next slide, Hafencity, I think, is a somewhat different example. And the key things to notice about Hafencity in Hamburg is that it's a highly synergistic environment, and the planning instruments are not those of a land use zoning plan. It is a plan that is based upon morphology, and the morphology is in the service of creating a mixed-use environment. And one of the things then it's important to notice is that this plan, as it moves from a first phase back here, through a second phase, onto a third phase and fourth, becomes increasingly complex. It was a plan that was, next slide please. It was a plan that was based very much on understanding a sequencing that would be that would make use of risk patterns, risk understandings on the part of developers to multiply the number of developers and stakeholders who would be involved, and to lower their risk through instruments that we can talk about later. Next, please. And so this was a plan that was based very much on an understanding of the nature of the particular parts of the fabric to create meaningful urban areas based upon movement and potential interaction amongst stakeholders, very much like what we have seen in a mature urban area like Bilbao or London. Next, please. And what we can see is that as it moves forward, it delivers really far more complex buildings, like the, go on now, at the same time that the first phase delivered very, very quickly a series of mixed-use buildings. Each of these buildings were developed by different developers and involved both residential and office spaces. Next, please. The second phase moved on extremely rapidly. Some of the same developers were also involved, so there was a learning process on the part of developers in creating ultimately a very high-level working environment, bringing Kuehne Nagel and Unilever into the project very, very early. Now, one of the I think I'm going to have to go much more quickly here. The Unilever building itself is something that creates a very public and very open environment. I think there's one. I think I need one more, a different switcher. Try that one. I'll try that one. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So now I'm actually going to zoom ahead of it since we've lost so much time with that. Okay. So this is. Now, one of the things that is important to notice about the Hafencity project is that this morphologically based, highly intensive project has created an environment that is that has moved very rapidly to become a high-quality public environment as well as a very strong business space. And it has done so without land use controls, but with a dynamic approach to the way in which design is linked to the planning instruments. There's a similar effort in One North in Singapore, and I know that Huang Yiming will talk about that later today, so I'm only going to spend a little bit of time on that. But if we can zoom in on the original land use conception, we can see that there was a first start to look at this as a land use strategy, very much like what we're seeing in the initial approaches to Nangang. But as we move forward, we can see that what it's actually going to be about is about the morphological transformation of a quite fragmented industrial and military district, which is near the National University Hospital and the National University of Singapore and the science parks, and to try to weave these together into a project that will be based upon the development of fabric and movement again. So you can see that the initial planning efforts were all based around the creation of an idea of morphology and fabric, very much like Hafencity. So when the first project was built then for Biopolis, it was one that emphasized the ground and the public quality, the interactive space, the space of interactions and learning that Michel has described as being so important to future economic processes. Now, the further refinement of the project drew upon lessons from places like the British Library in London, or other places in which we will see interactions of people with a sense of common purpose, or would be based upon understandings of the kinds of voids that are created in quality housing projects, such that you see the way in which interactions are created by the meaningful urban environments in which we live our everyday lives. Now, these kinds of understandings were then built into the refinement of the plan in such a way that the design was pulled upstream into the planning process. Now, the result then was that a much different vision evolved over time, such that you can anticipate the formation of new relationships through the planning process. Now, I think one of the things then that you want to learn for Nangang is the ways in which you would use these kinds of processes to pull design into the development of your instruments. Now, here in Zurich West, what we have is an example of taking an industrial community and having a very powerful approach to public space that begins to define ways in which a public space and a redefinition of the knowledge economy bases of an industrial community start to become pulled together into a rich understanding of urban living. And so here in Zurich, what we're seeing is a rich approach to design that allows us to have the crossover between higher value-added components of an industrial ecology and an urban strategy. Similarly, here in Basel, we see, again in Switzerland, an approach that stacks design, market research, engineering on top of the production floor of an industrial building. Again, looking for ways of intensifying industrial districts rather than isolating industry from the higher value components of the knowledge economy. Similarly, in Dresden, we see a factory taking some segments of the production process and pulling them together in such a way that a factory can become an exhibition space. People can come and watch cars being made here. Now, I think what we're seeing in all of these things is an approach to the development of a much more intensive urban landscape built around changing conceptions of workspace. I'm going to quickly go through a couple of more, if you'll indulge me, a couple more instances. This is the fabric of downtown Seattle. And here in Seattle, we see that the usual environment is one in which there's not much life on the street. But a recent project for the Seattle Public Library has begun to create a much richer public life on the interior of the building by changing the way in which a library is conceived. So a library becomes a tool for not only a change in the way we access information, the way we work within the knowledge economy, but also the way in which we can envision a civic landscape for a future city. So the usual typology of the library has changed dramatically to make use of current technologies in the way in which we access information, the way we could use a very different approach to light and dark within a library building, very deep plan office building, to in fact start to change the downtown area of Seattle to one where we would want to live next door to office buildings. So it's this combination of living, working, learning, and playing that becomes so compelling and that is achieved through an approach through architecture. Similarly, in London, we see this King's Place where we have the auditorium serving as a concert venue in the evening and a meeting space during the day. And what that means then is the business community is the one that's helping to deliver the cultural and creative possibilities of an urban environment. And here's the last project that we'll talk about, the Darwin Center, which is part of the complex of museums, scientific research institutes, and exhibition spaces within London. And what we can see is that it began with the idea of the Natural History Museum, the combination with Imperial College, and we have a series of crossovers between the research community, the public, and students in such a way that, again, it is a combination of stakeholders that is delivering what we might think of as an almost inside-out urbanism, where public space is pulled right into the heart of the building, and the building delivers a key component to the further definition, not only of the workspace community, the working community, the innovation community, but also to the very idea of what it would mean to transform an urban area based on the idea of networks rather than just corporations. And so I'd like to stop here. And what I want to suggest then is that what we have seen are a series of projects, both large and small, which nevertheless are based on the idea that you can use design and design reasoning to help develop next generation instruments and mechanisms for delivering the crossover between technology and the creative industries. That the business community can help support that if the design concepts are right. Thank you very much.